fund.
Right.
We went in July last year,
Right.
and it has taken us July to May to secure a program. We had a staff level agreement with the fund in December.
Right.
It's a relatively quick period. And finally in May, we've secured the fund.
What do you attribute the delays to?
I think it's the usual negotiations with the IMF. They take time. And in fact, the 10 months which has been involved in the Ghanaian program is one of the fastest on record. There's a whole lot of stuff that you have to go through in terms of exchange of data, the negotiations, making sure that the macro indices that you are looking for are in the right direction. All of these are the ones that consume the time. But nevertheless, it's over. And now we believe that it is going to provide us with a foundation for redirecting the economy, for repositioning the Ghanaian economy, firstly, to regain the macro stability that had been lost. Secondly, to be able to have a better control over important data like interest rates, inflation, and then finally also to position us to be able to go back into the international capital market, which had been a source of funding for us for the first 3 or 4 years of our government.
Do you see that happening soon? Because I know your finance minister said there's no rush to get back.
There's no rush to get back, but nevertheless, obviously, why not? Can we not take advantage of global savings? It makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. And the sooner we can do it, better. I think that what the finance minister means is that we're going to try as much as possible to maintain the discipline which is required, which is the most important prerequisite of a successful program.
You mentioned the discipline and the fact that it's over, but the reality is that the next tranche of funding, the $600 million, is contingent on Ghana being disciplined.
Oh, absolutely.
You've mentioned tax increases. What more have you assured the IMF that you will do?
The rationalization of our expenditures, the rationalization of government expenditures is something that we have given the assurance. The domestic revenue mobilization is absolutely critical for us. Already we're beginning to see signs of that. We are the fiscal deficit to come back within the thresholds that we have a fiscal responsibility law in Ghana, which has pegged our fiscal deficits at 5%. At the moment, is way above that, and the sooner we can bring that again to a more acceptable threshold, the better it is for our economy. So these are all several areas of activity that we see as being absolutely essential for the future of our country.
How concerned are you that, Ghana next year has an election, you'll be leaving office. Are you concerned, considering inflation right now is north of 40%, there's already a lot that Ghanaians are enduring, that this could potentially hurt your party going into the next election?
I think that the global situation has not been kind to incumbent governments all over the world, and our situation will be no different. But at the same time, I believe that we have enough time. We have 18 months. I leave office in January 25, which is literally 18 months, 19 months from now, to be able, with a very disciplined approach to the implementation of the IMF program, the repositioning of our economy, to be able to bring some growth back into the economy, some relief back to our population, to be able to convince them that, yes, it's worth them continuing the journey with my party and the new leader of our party, who we'll choose in November this year.
All right, good evening. Welcome to Bottomline. My name is Kenneth Jesse. It's the 29th day of May 2023. So that was President Akufo-Addo there in Doha, Qatar, making comments about Ghana going back to the international market for funds once the IMF bailout has been secured. I have in the studio a former finance minister in the person of SETH TERKPEH. We'll be delving into those issues and the implications of the conditionalities that have been set out by the International Monetary Fund after the break. Welcome back to Bottom Line on Metro TV. My name is Kenneth Jesse. Let's now show you excerpts of the country report on Ghana by the International Monetary Fund, projected right now on our screens. So this is it. It says a systematic framework will also be designed to protect vulnerable households from the impact of electricity tariff adjustments under the program. Lifeline tariffs may be redefined to improve the incidence of this subsidized price on low-volume users and ensure it targets the poorest households. A mapping exercise will also be undertaken to measure the impact of the existing cash transfer program on poor households with electricity access and allow for a better calibration of the program. Education. Now, Ghana spends close to 4% of GDP on education with good results in terms of enrollment, but poor learning outcomes, and that is according to the International Monetary Fund. It continues by saying that the flagship program, Free Senior High School, which covers the full cost of secondary education, has helped increase enrollment, but is poorly targeted. Key identified areas of potential improvement of education spending include strengthening primary education resources, better teacher training, and stronger performance-based funding practices. And it continues by saying that Ghana's fiscal policy has been characterized by recurring periods of overspending. Past budgets have been marked by overly optimistic forecasts, despite the existence of a fiscal council. The fiscal rules adopted in 2019 lack a debt target and feature an overly complex double operational rules system with poorly redefined escape clauses and no effective enforcement mechanisms. The Power Utilities Regulatory Commission, that is the PURC, recently raised electricity tariffs by close to 30%, bringing the cumulative increase since mid-2022 to 57% to help reduce the cost recovery gap and limit this year's shortfall to around 2.7% of GDP, offsetting underlying upward pressures from a more depreciated exchange rate. Now, additional quarterly tariff adjustments will be implemented in 2023 to compensate for any exchange rate and price movements and to bring tariffs close to cost recovery level, which efforts to improve operational efficiency of energy distribution as planned in the ERSP, and the regeneration of contracts with IPPS are expected to further reduce costs. It continues by saying that beyond 2023, the program's baseline projections conservatively assumes that the sector shortfall will be gradually reduced to reach 1.7% of GDP in 2026, and that is assuming modest tariff adjustments and slight improvement in grade or recovery losses. Staff urges the authorities to aim at a more rapid reduction in the sector shortfall under the ESRP to create fiscal space for priority spending. And this could, notably, it continues by saying that the Fiscal Responsibility Act will be amended to strengthen fiscal discipline. Audited SOE financial statements are to be submitted to the Ministry of Finance in a timely manner. The authorities will prepare a turnaround strategy to ensure Cocoa Board's financial viability. The Bank of Ghana Act will be revised to strengthen central bank dependency and mitigate fiscal dominance. The authorities are also committed to completing the remaining tasks from the financial sector cleanup and to implement reforms to support credit to the private sector. And it says removal of value-added tax exemptions, reformation of corporate income tax by phasing out tax holidays and exemptions, reducing customs exemptions, progressively increasing income taxes, automatically adjusting fuel levies. Quarterly tariff adjustments, which is already ongoing, employing 0.5% of the current labor force, limiting rate at which public sector workers' salary are increased, attaining tax to GDP ratio of 18% before end of 3-year IMF program. Second debt restructuring exercise will also take place. So these are the conditionalities outlined by the International Monetary Fund after they assessed Ghana's financial viability. Right. Welcome once again to the program. I have in the studio former Finance Minister SETH TERKPEH, who's joined me. Good evening, Mr. TERKPEH. Good to have you on the show. I mean, I outlined some of the conditionalities. It includes quarterly adjustment of electricity and water tariffs and so on and so forth. It also says that the free education program is poorly targeted. Let me hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, what you read is the program issues as the IMF staff see it, and then also what is called the staff appraisal, which is what the staff observes about the performance of the economy. I think we'll come to it. When we talk about the conditionalities, they normally have timelines.
Right.
And because we are in a program, excuse me, instead of, what we knew, for example, as a COVID loan, the funds are not going to be given to us upfront, as we had with the COVID loan and with the SDR. Rather, it will be performance-based. And there's a summary of those issues, including some of what you have read and things that needs to be done before various tranches or various portions of the amount of 3 billion will be released, to us. The 3 billion, the first 600 million has been released, and that is because we fulfilled what is called prior actions.
Right.
That is actions that you need to take before the IMF board meets. But even that, I think we should be cautious because we did not meet the external debt restructuring, which was a condition for going to the board. So if you read carefully, first of all, in May, Ghana was not listed as the countries, for which the board was going to meet to consider a program.
Right.
Then there was an announcement that by the 19th or so, the board was going to meet. And if you read the text carefully, it said that this was based on assurances given to the board by the team, the Paris Club and the non-Paris Club, chaired respectively by France and China. Assurances, their assurances that the external debt program, was going to commence and hopefully will be fulfilled. So, with all due respect, I think the optimism, of His Excellency the President, there's a major prior action. And we also know that there is a qualification against our domestic debt exchange, which you remember were issues that were in the SLA, the staff level agreement that we reached. At the time, some of us said we should be careful in our jubilation as though we had an IMF program, because they were clear that before the Africa Department, management would look at the program and then recommend it to the board. Those two activities had to be fulfilled, in addition to all the tax measures and others, which is among the tables which I sent to you. So in other words, we do still have things to do, some of which are likely now to be fulfilled, not as prior actions, but probably as a condition for the release of the second tranche,
right.
Of the of the money that comes with it, which is what we have going to consider on the board, I believe.
You are free to start with your presentation.
Well, yeah, it's just came with I don't know if they can
They were projected behind
It
you.
was projected.
But before they projected, yesterday during the State of the Nation's address by the president, or his address to Ghanaians as he puts it, he did mention that the IMF bailout does not really mean that the country will immediately be pulled out of the trenches. Was he really being honest?
Well, I would say it's a climb down, if
Right.
I may put it, because there was such optimism that this program was, going to. If, of course, initially we said we didn't even need a program at all, that we could do it, on our own. Then reluctantly we went into the program, and there was much optimism, as I said, even at the time the SLA,
Right.
was done, a certain history. So yes, I think it's a very pragmatic statement, because if you look at the depth of the problems that we have, and a period of it will take for us for even the debt to be sustainable, which is the thorny issue. It's a really long time, And so yes, I think it's appropriate for the president to be candid in telling Ghanaians that this was not. And let me give you some numbers.
Right.
Remember, I listened to the last segment on the COVID, levy, which, it's not going anywhere, appears not to go anywhere. Between 2020 and 2021, we had about 6 billion, excluding the 2 billion bond that we did. So about 8 billion US dollars, not Ghana cedis, flowing into the economy. For the 17 programs that we had done to do a correction, no government from the IMF perspective alone,
Right.
had received $1 billion. So we're talking about eightfold, or let's say sixfolds, because the 2 billion is our own borrowing. Had flowed into an economy for correction.
Right.
The largest was 915, if you recall, by the Mahama administration. Actually, about a half or more came to the benefit of the current administration, because remember, it strapped an election year, which is also what's going to happen, because this program would overlap 2024. So I'm saying that if you are looking at 3 billion, which is about half of what we received, in addition to the bonds which I mentioned,
Right.
and then you add other flows from the World Bank and others, including the other flows from the World Bank,
Right.
I could not take it out of, the problem. They rather appear to have even sunk deeper after all those flows. Then it should tell you that, we have to do a lot more work on our own than look to the 3 billion as was being touted initially.
That's
as
quite
a
interesting.
solution.
But your slides are currently projected behind you, so you can kindly go to the screen and start with your presentation for us.
Well, I'm not sure. Is it a touch screen?
Yes.
So what I've done is just reproduce. There are 3 important tables, in the which summarizes much of the obligation of what we have to do. Does it work? Okay. So I've added, some calculations on my own.
Right.
But when you talk about conditionalities and timelines, you see the dates, at the far left, to my left far end. So those are the dates when the IMF staff would come and do what we call reviews of the program to see whether some of the things we said we would do, which is in the, this column, we have done it. And then after which these releases will be made.
Right.
Okay, so you can see that the board dates, which is the May that just passed, the board had given approval based on the prior actions which I was talking about. We'll come to some of those, So upon that, SDR is IMF measure of currency, so we can ignore that. So after that, we got the first 600, million, which we are told has hit the
Account.
account. Okay, and it's a percentage of our quota is our share as members of the fund. But we can, in order not to complicate it, let's stick to the dollar, because that's the one that gives us the 3 billion at the end. Okay, so you see how long it will take for us to get, the entire, 3 billion that we are. So this is millions. Now, having received this money, November 1st this year, after our media review, the June performance criteria, the staff will come and assess it, and we'll come to the staff, the performance criteria, in the second table. Okay, so, and it's only when we have met those performance criteria that another 600 will be released. Now, everything being equal, it means that we are going to get 1.2, right? 1.2
billion
dollars.
Okay.
Remember what I said. For the entire period of the 2015 ECF, over a period which was to end in 2017 but was extended to 2019, we got from the IMF less than $1 billion. So the situation is so critical that even in the very first year of the program, we are getting more.
Right.
Or we are expected to get more, than, what we got for the entire, Mahama administration.
So if I understand you correctly, it means the severity of our financial constraints has really forced IMF to give us so much, even more than what ex-President Mahama had when he took us to the IMF during his regime.
It means that this is what we call front loading. And so if the amount of, you remember the total amount we expect is 3 billion.
Right.
And already we are close to half.
Right.
If this were not front loaded, as he said, then the situation would deteriorate further. And considering that much of the IMF money goes to Bank of Ghana, we knew that from the statements that by the time we went to the board, or I think earlier, we had come down in our reserves to 0.5. That's half a month.
Right.
Normally, even when we came down, it was around 3 months, 3.5 months, because of the heavy financing that Bank of Ghana had to do for the budget and also deplete our reserves to meet, our debt commitments, which nonetheless we had defaulted. And then we go into 2024, and there will be another review in May, and we are going this time, we will get 360, and then in November, we'll get 360. Okay? There's a question of the program overlapping the election year. Remember, November is close to the election year.
Right.
Right. So even whilst we are electioneering, there is a review that is taking place.
That's quite interesting.
Yes, and that is why we need to, understand. But the important thing is that we keep calculating cumulatively, and these two gives you 720. So if you were to add 720 to the 1.2, almost
That's almost 2 billion, yeah.
is gone. So by the time the current administration, those who ask what is obligation and others, by the time the current administration leaves, about 2/3 of the money would have gone. And it tells you the depth, of the problems. Then you go on in that sequence. So you will see here what one does is to look at, therefore you see the 20%, 20%, the ratios, as they go along. Right.
So all these ones are subject to us meeting those conditionalities. So
those were some of the conditionalities you were reading.
Right.
Yes. So maybe we can go to the next, the next slide quickly.
Kindly move to the next slide, okay?
Yes. So these are just notes. I've been speaking to them, the front loading, and here it is the considered view that by the time we are looking at the fourth review or the November 2024 review, there will be a change in administration, irrespective of whether it's NDC or NPP.
Yes, that's true.
And it would therefore be very important, at that point for the next administration, which is why, for example, in 2016, you would, anytime the fund came to town, they spoke to the then opposition. And you had a lot of, comparisons and things being made. So I think it's very critical in the political economic context, that, we should note that, even whilst we are talking transition, whilst we are, even if, there will be that change. Now you will see that the next administration gets to use only 1/3 of the total loan amount, given that the NPP's record of handling 6 million, as I said earlier on, could not help us, and even COVID and other buffers, are still being retained. Okay, so next slide, please. So I've spoken to many of these things already.
Yes.
Now, so you see these are the structural conditionalities, right? So the first one was to enact legislation, some laws, by executive order of parliament, to bring the non-primary balance and other revenue situation under control. That's a prior action. So I was talking about the prior actions that went. This was also a prior action, electricity tariff. You were mentioning it. So it means that, you remember what you read was that the government had already increased the tariff and is expected to.
Yes.
So that's
50%.
So that's a prior action, which was, at the time, some of us were saying many of the things going to parliament were prior actions, and that the Ghanaian public should be made aware of the fact that, but it didn't happen. Now we know they were prior actions. So this whole page were the prior actions, the memorandum between Ministry of Finance and Bank of Ghana, which we signed, which resulted in the zero financing. If you remember that phenomenon, the zero financing of the budget.
Yes.
It's being repeated again. Now the question is, the climb is deeper now, because BOG has financed up to 44 billion, of the last budget, right? So how do you climb to the point of zero? That is and that is why the revenue measures and others have to come in, considering that we are not.
So if I understand that aspect perfectly, it means that the Bank of Ghana should cease financing the central bank.
Actually, it's an extreme position, and in fairness, we objected, but we're able to, even though we met the zero financing, we insisted on the 5% in the Banking Act.
Okay.
So, and that remains what it is. But if you're in a program and you have to meet it as a condition, remember, for getting some funds, right?
Right.
Then you have to meet it, because at that point, and then you see the publication of the Auditor General's report. Back then, it came all the way up and discussions were held. Few people knew that this was a prior action for going to the board. Because remember in Article 4, 2021, the fund had raised issues, with the use of the COVID funds.
Right.
Yes.
Let's stay a bit longer on the COVID-19, because the World Health Organization says it's no longer a global health emergency. President Akufo-Addo has also said that it's no longer a health emergency in the country. Now that it is no longer a health emergency, even by the government of Ghana and also by the World Health Organization, do you think the COVID taxes should be abolished?
It's not surprising to some of us, because let me take your mind back to 3 other taxes.
Right.
One, ESLA. ESLA was to be 3 to 5 years. And then it was to go away. And that amount, even in the language of current administration, in 2007, April, was supposed to eliminate the energy sector debt, which we linked, to the banking sector. It never went away. 2015, so about 10 years on, to the point now we have even added it to the debt exchange, because the funds have been utilized, the IPPs are up in arms, they've not been finished paying them, together with, so that is one example of a levy that never went away. Secondly, the stability levy we just passed. Remember they had amended the fiscal stabilization levy, which again was to go away when we got 3 oil fields. And I'm pointing this out because we have, anytime the economy was in trouble, we had these temporary taxes from the Rawlings administration. And then once, by the end of an IMF program, we took them out.
Removed.
So we call it National Stabilization Levy or Fiscal Stabilization Levy, and then the temporary import duty. And then due to doomsday and other factors, the subsidies that were not paid, we brought in ESLA. All these were not taken off. So, and we've been raising this for a very long time. So there's generally an awakening because a lot had been put on COVID for the reason that we had the economy. But you can see it's not going away. So the COVID levy is not the only one that's not going away. In fact, as we speak, we have about 13 levies
that are not going
away. And so if you look at an import bill, you see all of them listed. Right? And it has distorted the tax regime to the extent that even a portion of the VAT, was taken out. That's 5%, National Health Insurance Levy, and then the GET Fund. Those were not designed as levies. They were designed, one, as we were just talking about social intervention for health education to boost the highest form of social, And then they were collected as though they were a VAT. They were actually increases in VAT. The current government took them out and is denying businesses the input tax credit and a refund, turned it into a levy, the street levies. So I just want to draw attention to the fact that it's not a new phenomenon at all. It's only because, it is COVID and it is so obvious, right? But remember, we are keeping the COVID levy, despite what I said earlier on, 6 billion flowing in. We can count it. We had the IMF COVID loan, 1 billion. We had a SDR from the IMF, another 1 billion. Bank of Ghana, if you remember, 10 billion or 1.7 billion. Our own stabilization levy, 250 million, which increased to 400 million, was also taken. World Bank, African Development Bank added together is about 1 billion. So, honestly, if it is for COVID, funds came in for COVID.
From the World Bank.
Travelers paid for COVID. Right? And so why are we keeping it? It tells you the pre-existing difficulties that the economy had, which was being disputed before COVID. And even now we have a fiscal gap, which is predicated on the successful implementation of the external debt. And remember, there were fiscal gaps, some of us were saying, in the Article 4, 2019, and in the COVID report, and this was vehemently denied. In this current one, there is a fiscal gap, despite all the flows, the 3 billion we're talking about and everything. And so if the president, that's a context in which reality is setting in, and as we said, the president now stating, that, it will not be, the fund program is not the end. And therefore, what are we doing? We have to go back to, some domestic measures to make it. Now, so these were the prior actions. So you see, ensure that GET Fund, Road Fund, DACF starts reporting provisional. This is something that was stopped, because this was part of GIFMIS. You see, the GIFMIS is mentioned, right? GIFMIS is a household name. Since when did GIFMIS reform start? As far back as 2010, right? And you remember things were being said about transactions going around, GIFMIS not being fully reported. It's just a matter of applying codes. If you apply a code for Ministry of Education, right, there will be a sub-code for GET Fund. So we don't have to treat it in any special way, and it will be reported under Ministry of Education. If you apply a code for Ministry of Roads and Highways, and there's a road fund, you just apply a sub-code for beginning, if Ministry of Roads and Highways is 0.3, that's the third ministry, then road fund will be 0.3 point something, a source of funds under them. So these were all reforms. Hyperon was the last of the GIFMIS, and this one is the budget system, which is linked to, because we were using GIFMIS, even though it's a total acronym for the whole system, fiscal system, we were using, that was associated more with the controller financial accounting system.
Right.
So the Hyperion came in, and then there was the HRMIS, which is mentioned elsewhere. So these were all reforms, that I wouldn't say were completed, but we're going into phase 2, like the revenue reforms, GRA. Remember, GRA was created, immediately Professor Mills,
right.
Came in. Remember, VAT service and IRS, were put together as a domestic tax division, of GRA. Remember, the customs division was created. And then electronic. Remember, West Blue. Remember, single window, which today is called ICOMS.
Right.
What is missing? We didn't continue with the domestic tax, element. We started with the contract database.
And could it have changed anything?
Of course, yes, it would. If it wouldn't change anything, because these are global initiatives, and the fund has a technical side. If it wouldn't change anything, the fund will never make it a prize.
Right.
So maybe we can look at
the next slide.
Yes. So that's the 5th. There are 5 here. And these are just commentaries, some of what I've been talking about, the Hyperion system and others. So we can go to, and then the 5% BOG. And so now we come to what we should do. We're done with the prior actions. What are we to do going forward? And you can see, this is the dates I was talking about for, those releases. You have 2023, end June, they'll do a review, and so end June, when they come for the review, these are the things which are going to be considered. Next, please.
Next slide. Okay.
That's also, this is just another comment on it. Next slide. And then you see it continues September, December 2023. But remember, the program is not ending in 2023. So there will be a new set of, actions, right? Going into 2024, 2025, and
beyond.
And beyond. So this is actually, I reproduced them from, from the IMF documents. And so the producers can have a look at it. This is the leap we were talking about. Right. Remember, yes, the prior action. This is the tax administration system I was talking about.
Right.
We should have been a domestic tax system that will interface with the customs, system, so that we make it. And so there were things like EVAT and others. It doesn't constitute a complete system. So they are saying all of this should be included in a domestic tax system. Now, this is something we're doing, but under the previous program, it was part of our homegrown policy. So it wasn't something which the fund was dictating. Okay. But because, it didn't continue, it's now become, a conditionality, if you like. So this, as far as, the conditions, the prior actions and others, are concerned.
When you were explaining, you did indeed explain that this is going to go far beyond 2024 when this regime will be out of office and all that. My producers are telling me that we have to go for a break, but when we come back from the break, I'll continue with that question. You're still watching Bottomline here on Metro TV. I am here with the former Finance Minister, SETH TERKPEH. My name is Kenneth Jesse. We'll be back from this break with more. Welcome back to Bottomline. I'm here with the former Finance Minister, SETH TERKPEH. Before we went for the break, I was asking you the implications of the conditionalities of this IMF, bailout for future governments and indeed the citizens, because it's going to stretch beyond 2023. We have so many years to fulfill all of these conditionalities. What are the implications?
Well, let me state clearly that the 2015 program that overlapped the 2016 elections, because if you add the homegrown that we were doing, we're consulting, was a conscious decision taken by President Mahama to prove the point that you don't have to, spend your way through elections. And also there was a lot of distortion, which created the impression that, the Mahama administration had actually overspent during the elections. But you see, after persistent insistence that the record should be corrected, we now know that the deficit was 6.1. And on a new basis, we now know that we ended 2016 at 57%. And therefore, that it was possible. It was possible, to be in an IMF program, adhere to the actions, and because all the structural measures were measures like GIFMIS sinking fund, which was being discussed, the contingency fund, infrastructure fund, and all those things, were the structural measures that you needed as a middle-income country. You can't continue. As a middle-income country, you lose concessional financing, you lose grants. So you have to put in ways in which you can borrow more expensively, but still keep the economy going. That's the rationale for those measures, which are resurfacing, here. Okay, so that was a conscious decision. Now, this overlap, I'm not sure was a conscious decision, is a reality. That there's no way in which you could have a program that could tackle these issues as effectively by 2024 during the elections. And therefore it overlapped. I think President Mahama has commented on this already. And for the NDC, hopefully, as we do expect, we had set the precedence of making, program overlap election years. So we'll see whether there will be fiscal discipline. We all knew what some of the discussions were, including parties, during the COVID period and the COVID resources, which was suspected to have gone into the 2020 elections and all those. So this will be another test to apply the resources to the problems of the economy. Yes, but it's inevitable that the new government will inherit the program because, as you can see, the situation is deep, such that the table is not here. But by the time, we mentioned it, 2/3, the resources would have gone. And you can see that we do not even have an indication of what we need to do. Mm-hmm. If you take the flagship, we are now being told that a strategy will be developed. Were we not told a while ago that there was a strategy to make some of these things effective, free SHS? We are now being told that the flagship, that a strategy will be developed. So if that's all that's going to be done by next year, right? And mind you, the prior actions that we listed and the conditionalities that we listed to follow,
right?
You didn't see free SHS there, so it's vague. There is no specific thing to be done, unlike the others which were there. They're quite specific. Right? And it expresses the reluctance. Right. So the other answer to your question is, whichever government comes in should expect that the causes of expenditure, compensation, interest, may not change because you can't do that only on tax policy, because the tax policies measures are distorting the tax regime, and that's why they are not buoyant. Right? If you have 13 levies and they are the ones that will do the trick, including yield levy, your tax to GDP ratio would be around 18%, and it will fill that, revenue deficit gap, and you borrow less, right? So when I hear comments, from senior officials saying the elephant in the room is not flagship programs, the elephant in the room is compensation, and today we know what's going on compensation and interest. Remember that the total revenue is being taken by these two items. I think we've discussed this, we even discussed it here. Ghanaians had come to that appreciation. And therefore, the elephant that is not in the room, which we are saying is not the issue, that's the ones you are borrowing to pay. Because you've exhausted your revenue. Mm-hmm. So you are borrowing to pay for the elephants They are not in the room because there's no space in the room. Maybe like a camel, they are, head, but it's in the tent, but they are big, right? And so you borrow, then you know that we use bonds, at the point we were arguing about using heritage fund, for those. So they would have to be rationalized.
Right.
And I'm very skeptical that if we do not do serious expenditure measures, which previous governments have done.
Right. So what would SETH TERKPEH have done differently? How would you have negotiated with the International Monetary Fund if you were finance minister today?
What did we do to get, 6.1% deficit? What did we do to pay off 550 out of 750 US dollars of the first sovereign bond? Our own cash, sinking fund. Right? What did we do by putting money aside for disaster like Kwame Nkrumah, flood, and victims? They seem to be modest. And what did we do such that this administration was able to take 240 million US dollars, which we had left, right, to resolve COVID? That was with one oil field. If we had put in with 3 oil fields, let's say pro rata, 750, we'll go to the IMF to borrow 250 million, not 1 billion. Or yes, right? So I'm saying that to the extent that you see those same measures, which we initiated under the homegrown portion of the program, resurfacing, tells you that some of them hold a solution, to our problems.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what we would. So pipeline, that's what we call a contract database. You remember it was said that we had left some arrears of 11 billion, 7 billion. At the New Year school, it ended up that the 7 billion had been offset by, 5 billion, and only 2 billion was set forward. There was a principle behind it, and the principle behind it was to move the country to what accountants will call semi-accrual accounting. Why? Because we did not have a full record of the number of contracts that were awarded in the system. And so we had started compiling that. And that's a contract database. It's been shown here. When they talk about arrears, let me give you a figure. The 2023 budget had arrears of 1.9 billion to be settled. By the time the IMF went through, the report which we said should be published in the Public Financial Management Act, they've adjusted it to 40 billion. Can you imagine the difference? 20-something billion and some more to be paid, similar to single spine.
Right.
So the short answer to your question is to do what we feel vindicated by the very program, because they are there. You heard Dr. Kwaji talking about sinking fund. You've seen the program talking about giftness. You've seen the program talking about revenue administration, reforms, electronic. You've seen the program saying that the iTax should be installed, which is what these were programs we were doing, already, which the fund feels justified. That's, they hold the key.
Right.
So we'll continue to do that,
Okay.
right? And then we would do some more.
Finally, 17 times the economy has crumbled. 17 times you've gone for the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Can we ever get to a point where the country will never go to the IMF for a bailout?
I think we should qualify this. We should be careful. You'll be making a promise which you may never fulfill. Remember during the global financial crisis, it was so severe that Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, all of them are advanced countries, which gave the acronym PICS, went to the IMF for a standby arrangement, right? Because the situation was so severe, right? So my answer is yes, it's possible for us, right, to win ourselves off the IMF, but as members of the fund, hold onto our right to go to the IMF. If after you exhaust your 750 million in the stabilization fund, as I was saying, and you are going to the IMF with your own buffers, that's what you call buffers. And the program talks about buffers for even the financial side. So if you are able with you were able with 3 oil fields to increase, your own means of managing ups and downs of the economy,
Right.
750, you will not go and borrow 1 billion.
I want to believe that.
You'll borrow, that's what you can stand by, 250.
I want to believe that by the financial crisis, you're talking about the one in 2008,
Absolutely,
right?
yes.
And we also recently had a global, crisis caused by COVID-19 and
Absolutely.
the war in Ukraine and Russia. So don't you think the government is a bit justified when they keep referencing those?
Nobody is underestimating COVID. But the point we keep making is that if you underestimate, remember before COVID, right, the deepest crisis after the Depression was the global financial crisis. But when you come and belittle, right, and belittle the effects of the global financial crisis, you will never be prepared for COVID. Because you cannot run an economy for 3 to 4 years without one crisis or the other. It could be commodity prices that have gone down for us, right? It could be disease, Ebola, COVID, whatever. And if I believe you were listening carefully to the U.S. debate on debt, right? You see that one of the solutions coming up is that they should use the 40 trillion or something, I forget the figure, some amount of money which they had put aside for COVID but did not use to now bring down the debt.
We are running out of time, but in 30 seconds, my very last question before we go. President Akufo-Addo said the country is now ready to go to the international market to borrow again. Was that too fast a comment to make?
I think it's fast. For me, he's the president. Give us a path to go into the market faster than the IMF is saying. Give us a path to go into the IMF faster than Fitch and other ratings agencies, S&P, are saying, right? So he's my president, right? Sometimes the presidents have information which, even if you were a minister or former minister, you wouldn't know. There may be some basis. But for heaven's sake, we don't want to wake up to be told that there's no strategy yet for special programs, including free HHS and the rest. So I hope that we will not wake up 3 years from now or 2 years after this administration is gone to say that it was another rhetoric and it wasn't, based on a timeline. So let's put the timeline, in the program, and then we can, monitor it.
Mr. SETH TERKPEH is a former finance minister. I've been in the studio with him discussing the IMF conditionalities. My name is Kenneth. Jesse, thank you very much for being a part of the show tonight. See you next week.